Hello everyone, tonight we step softly through a palace where the air itself seems to hold its breath. You're not walking into splendor, at least not the kind gilded with gold and laughter. No. You're entering Escorial, Spain's cold, granite-skinned monastery palace. The year is 1598, and behind the curtains of its most private chamber, the most powerful man in the world is unraveling in silence. This isn't a story of battles, banners, or banquets. It's about slow decay. The slow, aching descent of Spain's King Philip II, ruler of half the known world, into a body riddled with disease, a mind cluttered with paperwork, and a palace haunted by echoes of days lost. And yes, you probably won't survive this one either. Not without squirming a little at what unchecked power, religious obsession, and royal loneliness can do to a man. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a room where the windows are covered not just by shutters, but by thick, heavy curtains. The kind of curtains that seem like they're not there to block out sunlight, but memory. The smell is medicinal resin wax, damp stone. Maybe a hint of something older like dust that's learned to pray. You're in the private chambers of King Philip II of Spain, and he's in the final season of his life. It's not a dramatic deathbed scene yet. Right now, the monarch is propped up in a wooden chair that looks more penitential than royal. The chair is narrow, stiff, and low-backed, as if the king has chosen to suffer vertically. His legs are elevated slightly, resting on a pillow. Not for comfort, but necessity. Gout doesn't negotiate. The light here comes from candles placed meticulously, so their wax drips into tiny iron bowls. There's no chaos in this room. Just ritual, precision, stillness. Outside, the vast empire waits for word. Inside, the king counts his pain in measured breaths. Behind you is the long corridor of El Escorial, echoing with the footsteps of monks and servants. Built like a monastery in a fortress, the palace is stark, no playful fountains, no laughing courtiers. Philip had it constructed with a funeral in mind, his own. The man quite literally built his tomb before climbing into it. You shift your gaze toward the bed. It's not large, just wide enough for one man to die in. And it's positioned oddly. Not against a wall or in the center of the room, but facing a private altar. Yes, his deathbed stares directly at salvation. Or at judgment, depending on how honest he's feeling that day. A priest murmurs Latin nearby eyes, low voice low. You can't tell if it's a prayer for healing or for forgiveness, or if those two things are even different anymore. Philip himself, he's awake. But his eyes don't settle on you. They drift to the crucifix, to the fire, to something you can't see. His face is pale but not ghostly. His beard is carefully trimmed. He's still king, still clinging to dignity. Even as his insides rebel, his legs betray him, and the empire slips grain by grain through his fingers. And yet, here he remains. Not in Madrid, not on campaign, but here, in this chamber of shadows and saints. The silence isn't peaceful. It's loaded. Every cough in the hallway could be the start of a rebellion. Every footstep might bring news from Flanders or England or the Americas. But inside this chamber, it's just him and you, and history breathing faintly in the cracks of the stone. Historians still argue whether Philip isolated himself out of piety or paranoia, whether he truly believed suffering brought him closer to God, or whether he just didn't know how to be happy in the presence of light. One candle guttering in the corner throws shadows like outstretched hands. You wonder if he sees them too. You wonder if they comfort him. In a palace meant to impress God, the only thing growing brighter is the end. And it begins to feel less like a royal chamber and more like a confessional made of stone. It's small, surprisingly so. Not what you'd expect for a king who once ruled lands so far-flung they joked the sun never set on his empire. But this space is no throne room. It's a box wrapped in silence. At first glance, there's almost nothing in it. A narrow bed, a hard chair, a small writing table. One bookshelf. No grand paintings. No golden embroidery. No velvet drapes flowing in the breeze because there are no windows to open. Just the altar across from the bed, flickering with a single oil lamp. You wonder how many monarchs have lived with less than this. You wonder if anyone ever told Philip that a little fresh air might do him good. He didn't need splendor. He needed control. And here he had it. This tiny room, wedged into the heart of Escorial, directly beside the chapel, was deliberately designed by Philip himself. Not his architects, not his advisors. He chose it. He even oversaw its layout. A place where he could be close to God and to death. Just a short breath away from where royal ancestors slept beneath marble. So that when he did die, they wouldn't have to move him far. You shift uneasily. This is not a romantic melancholy. It's administrative grief, efficient sorrow. The walls are smooth and bare except for a crucifix made from dark wood. Not ornate, not decorated. Just plain. It doesn't ask for your awe. It demands your silence. Philip sits with a blanket across his knees. His feet are swollen. You can smell it faintly, the sweet, sour scent of infection. His left hand shakes just a little when he moves it, adjusting a paper on the desk. The movement is slow, painful. Like every gesture must be negotiated with some invisible tormentor. On that desk, letters. Always letters. Notes from across the empire. Reports from New Spain. Updates from Antwerp. Requests from bishops. Warnings from generals. Complaints from peasants. And he reads them all. Or tries to. Even now, even here, with his skin cracked from fever, his fingernails turning gray, he is still governing. He doesn't trust others to do it right. They used to call him the Paper King. Not because he was weak, but because he ruled through ink. While other kings led armies into battle, Philip led memos into war. He didn't need to swing a sword, he could conquer with margins and footnotes. He micromanaged the world from this desk, from this very room, even as his body tried to fall apart beneath him. And he kept records of everything. Literally everything. There are archives filled with his marginalia, little comments scrawled in Latin or Castilian, or even a clumsy bit of French. Sometimes just one word. Urgent. Delay. Fool. As if every problem could be solved with the right kind of ink. You reach for one letter, it's addressed from the colonies. A governor reporting food shortages. Another mentions an outbreak. There's a dried wax seal cracked. You imagine the person who sent it. Probably expecting a swift response. Probably dead by now. Paper doesn't age as fast as people. And yet he still reads. Historians still argue whether Philip's obsession with correspondence was brilliant administration or delusional control. Whether he kept the empire afloat through sheer attention or strangled it with excessive detail. Across the room, a servant shifts. You hadn't noticed him before. He's holding a bowl of water, a cloth. He's waiting to wash the king's hands. But Philip hasn't signaled him yet. He won't. Not until the letter is finished. Time moves differently in here, like molasses in winter. You start to feel it in your own limbs, the weight of routine, the pressure of stillness. as though the room refuses to let you rush. And maybe that was the point, because for Philip, death was not a surprise waiting in the dark. It was a guest, slow, methodical, predictable, something to plan for, to supervise, to meet in perfect order with pen in hand and documents in order. You hear footsteps in the hall, another priest arriving, another prayer on its way. The room never lacks for spiritual noise, but it's earthly voices that are thinning. This is how power fades here, not with drama, but with repetition. He's expecting a report. But you've got nothing, no petitions, no requests for land or favor. You're just here, watching, observing a monarch disintegrate from the inside out, still wearing the thin armor of divine responsibility. Philip shifts in his chair and winces. Not dramatically, he wasn't one for theatrics, but the kind of wince that says this isn't the first time that joint failed him today. His hand finds the edge of the desk and holds there. You can tell he's measuring how long he can go before asking for help to stand. He's always measured everything. It started long before the pain. You think back to his boyhood. A prince carved from expectation and carved by it. He was raised under the looming shadow of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, master of Europe, warrior statesman, the kind of father who makes tough love look like a spa treatment. Philip wasn't taught to laugh. He was taught to rule. When Charles finally abdicated in 1556, he handed his son the keys to a kingdom so vast it made maps uncomfortable. Spain, Naples, the Netherlands, the Americas. Charles had ruled with charisma on horseback, through battle cries and coronation spectacles. Philip would rule from a desk, in silence, through letters and ledgers, and he did. For decades, without drama, without gossip, without flamboyance. He married for politics, not passion. He prayed longer than he danced. Actually, he didn't dance. Ever. Not even once. This is not conjecture. Contemporary courtiers actually noted, the king does not dance. Imagine being that consistent. And it worked. For a time. But something happens to a man when he inherits the world too young and is never allowed to leave the office. He calcifies, becomes part of the building. And Escorial Philip's great architectural projects wasn't a palace so much as a projection, a cold granite echo of how he viewed the world, austere, ordered, immovable. The entire thing was shaped like a grill. Yes, a grill, in honor of St. Lawrence, who was martyred by being roasted alive. Some say Philip believed this geometry would please God. Others say it was just his version of feng shui, but more Catholic and a lot more flammable. You hear a soft cough from the bed. A servant steps forward offering warm broth in a shallow silver bowl. Philip declines with a flick of the fingers. He's not hungry. You're not surprised. He hasn't been hungry for years, not for food, not for laughter, not even for victory anymore. Just peace. If such a thing exists for kings. Historians still argue whether Philip was a visionary leader who stabilized Spain or an anxious micromanager whose obsession with order sowed the seeds of its decline. What's certain is that he did not rest. Not in youth. Not in triumph. Not now. You glance at a tapestry behind him, the only real decoration in the room besides the crucifix. It's faded, threadbare in some places, but you can make out a battle scene. Horses rearing soldiers frozen mid-charge. You wonder if he remembers those victories, or if they too have dulled into just another page in a ledger, just another memo sent. The silence returns, filled only by the scrape of quill on parchment. You wonder if he dreams of running, of riding, of stepping outside this monastery of his own making and simply breathing. But no, he doesn't dream anymore. Because dreaming is for princes. Philip is no longer a prince. He is a relic still living, a memory still moving, a monarch who traded glory for God and comfort for control. And you're still sitting there, watching the weight of the world collapse inward, not with fire, but with formality. And the flick of candlelight down a nearby hall. The chamber you've just left doesn't vanish, it lingers. Like a scent, like the afterimage of a candle snuffed. You carry its silence with you, wrapped around your shoulders like one of Philip's heavy woolen cloaks. But this next room tells a different story. This is the chapel, the spiritual engine of Escorial, and the beating, burning heart of the king's internal life. It's quiet here too, but not the kind of quiet that suffocates. This is the quiet of expectation, of ritual, of divine surveillance. Gold gleams in the high altar, though much of it is cloaked in shadow. Candles line the side walls, flickering like the breath of 1,000 whispered prayers. And at the far end, beside a narrow stone rail, is a kneeling bench, small, plain, with an indentation so worn it looks like the wood has sighed under decades of elbows. That's where he used to kneel, every morning, sometimes before sunrise. You imagine the scene, Philip shuffling from his chamber, already in pain, already limping and bowing before the crucifix with a kind of desperate reverence. Not theatrical, not performative, just habitual. Like a man writing the same word again and again, hoping one day it'll mean something different. The court mocked him for it, of course, quietly, of course. They called him El Prudente, the careful one, which sounds polite until you realize it was shorthand for boring. Even other monarchs couldn't relate. They wrote poetry. They fenced. Philip kept lists of sins, of relics, of hours spent in prayer. You step toward the altar and glance up. High above, gilded saints stare down from niches. Their faces calm, their eyes blank. You wonder if Philip imagined them watching, judging, approving. Did they see his decisions as righteous, or were they simply waiting like celestial bureaucrats to tally the cost of every war, every execution, every burned heretic? He loved this place, loved this. Not because it brought him joy, but because it brought him order. Everything had its place here, just like in his mind. The chapel leads to a smaller sacristy where a priest is folding vestments. He nods at you but says nothing. That's the rule here, reverence before interaction. It's a hard habit to break. Even your own thoughts feel like they should be whispered. You notice a small reliquary on the wall. Glass encased. It holds a bone. Not labeled, not glorified, just present. Like so many things Philip clung to. The past made physical, sanctified, controlled. You remember one of the more peculiar bits of history. Philip once collected the kneecap of a saint. Not a full femur, not a dramatic skull. A kneecap. The kind of relic that says, I want God's favor, but I'm also into orthopedics. He believed proximity to holiness brought protection, perhaps even clarity. Historians still argue whether his obsession with relics was superstition or political theater. But to Philip, they were companions, silent, incorruptible, obedient. Unlike ministers, or generals, or sons, especially sons. You pause at the edge of the transept and glance back toward the hall leading to his private room. You can almost see the connection, the invisible line between his bed and this altar, between his pain and his penitence, between a dying man and the God he feared not loving him back. No one ever called Philip warm, but here in this space filled with wax smoke and holy dust, you start to feel the weight of his hunger. Not for power, not for praise, but for rightness, to make things correct, measured, eternal. even if he had to erase himself in the process. And in many ways he did. He became a shadow behind the golden altars, a voice that never shouted but never stopped whispering either. A king who ruled not with presence, but with persistence. And here in the chapel that persistence lingers, in the silence, in the soot, in the still burning candles left for saints who never answer. To the palace proper, and the shift is immediate. The temperature dips. The marble feels colder underfoot. And the walls, though still dressed in symmetry, feel just a little less sacred and a little more strategic. You're entering the corridors that held empires together. And now you're about to walk through the echo of Philip's marriages. All 4 of them. Yes, 4. And no, none of them ended in a fairy tale. Unless your idea of romance involves diseased diplomacy and deeply repressed grief. Philip's first marriage was to Maria Manuela of Portugal. They were both 16. Royal, attractive, genetically too similar for anyone's comfort. She died just 4 days after giving birth to their son Don Carlos. The child survived. She didn't. It was the first time the crown outlived the crown jewel. Then came Queen Mary I of England. Yes, that Mary. Bloody Mary, if you're being tabloidy. The marriage was political, of course it was. Philip became King Consort of England, technically. But the English never loved him. Mary adored him, though perhaps too much. He tolerated her. Some historians say he tried to care. Others suggest he simply endured. When Mary died childless, England slipped through his fingers like a soap bar in cold water. Third Elizabeth of Valois, young, French, lively, and miraculously someone he actually seemed to like. They had a warm, almost tender correspondence. When she died suddenly at 23, Philip was reported to have locked himself away for days. This was rare. He never mourned in public. This time, he forgot to pretend. Finally, Anna of Austria, his niece. Let's pause there for a moment. Yes, niece. She bore him more children than any of the others, including Philip III, his heir. She was dutiful, obedient, kind by most accounts. And like the others, she died too. 4 wives, 4 funerals. You pass a tapestry that shows Elizabeth of Valois hunting with hounds. She looks radiant, strong, alive in a way no one in this palace does anymore. Behind a half-closed door, you catch a glimpse of one of the royal chaplains polishing a reliquary. The shape looks oddly familiar. And then it clicks. It's a bone. A finger, perhaps. Preserved behind glass trimmed with silver. Maybe someone else's wife or saint. In Escorial, it's hard to tell the difference. Philip never remarried after Anna. He simply folded inward. Focused on prayer politics and pain, always more pain. And when you think about it, it wasn't just women who died around him. It was joy. Historians still argue whether Philip's sorrow was sincere or convenient. Whether his grief was genuine or part of the Catholic monarch persona, a man so devoted to God, he had no room left for earthly delight. But you can't fake certain silences. And El Escorial is full of them. You pass a portrait gallery. The frames are gilded, but the faces inside look tired. Regal, yes, but drained. Generations of Habsburgs, all with that same heavy jaw and haunted stare. It's not a family tree. It's a visual family obituary. And then, in the corner, a smaller frame. Less ornate. Elizabeth again. She's younger here. Her eyes are softer. You realize he kept this one close. Not in a throne room, not in the main gallery, but tucked away behind layers of stone and shadow. This wasn't meant for the public. This was private pain. You imagine Philip, bent by age and arthritis, stopping here. Looking up, not saying anything. just remembering a face that didn't ask him to be king, just a man. But even that was too much for him to hold on to. So he let the world in. And the world, being what it is, took everything he gave, where the granite darkens slightly touched by age and candle soot. The smell shifts again, paper now. Ink. Oil from too many lamps burning late into too many nights. You've entered Philip's study. Not the grand sword with ceiling frescoes and towering bookshelves. No, this one's intimate, almost bare. Just one high desk, one low stool, and a world balanced on parchment. This is where the Paper King earned his nickname. And you start to see why. There are stacks everywhere. Stacks of letters, reports, receipts. Pages folded, sealed, annotated. A system of chaos only Philip could decipher. Or perhaps not even him anymore. The walls are lined with pigeonholes filled with correspondence. One for Flanders, one for Naples, one for the Inquisition naturally, one ominously just labeled urgent. The man ruled an empire by memo, and that's not hyperbole. He wrote tens of thousands of letters, with his own hand often. When his fingers failed, he dictated. When his breath wheezed, he whispered. But he never stopped. You'll run your fingers along one stack. It's dated from the time of the Morisco Revolt. Spanish Muslims forced into Christianity, then into silence, then into rebellion. And in the middle of it all, Philip writing letters from this desk, instructing his generals, correcting priests, debating punishment, all without leaving this room. He trusted paper more than people. Some say he even micromanaged his troops' marching routes down to which village they should camp in and on what day. Imagine trying to fight a war with your king breathing down your parchment. But this wasn't madness. It was method. He believed divine order could be enforced through royal ink. That if he simply wrote enough, explained enough, controlled enough, God would reward him with a peaceful kingdom. Spoiler, God did not. You pick up one letter and read a line in the margin delay this decision. Pray first. Even here, bureaucracy bowed to faith. On the desk lies a sand shaker used to blot ink before it smears. It's simple wooden worn smooth. Not royal, not grand. Just functional. Like everything in Escorial. Next to it, a list. Not of enemies. Not of policies, of saints. Yes, he cataloged them too. Names, feast days, relic locations. You can't tell if it's reverence or inventory. You suspect Philip couldn't either. Historians still argue whether this obsessive administration was genius or illness. Was he a brilliant manager burdened by the scale of his dominion, or a man drowning in detail, afraid to let go of even a pebble, for fear the mountain would fall? You look to the chair. It's carved wood. No cushion, no gold leaf, no coat of arms. Just a notch worn into the backrest where his spine settled day after day. You imagine the posture upright, austere, unflinching. Spine straight even as the world bent. Behind the desk is a single tapestry. Not war this time, not saints. Just the map of Spain, unlabeled. Just its silhouette. Sharp, proud. You realize something chilling. There's no depiction of Philip in this room. Not one. This was never about ego. It was about control. Legacy was vanity, but order was divine. The quill lying across a blank page is soaked through at the tip. He wrote something recently. You resist the urge to read it. The paper's still slightly damp. You imagine him hunched to your legs, trembling under the table, scribbling until his hand cramps lips, moving in silent Latin, his soul stapled to duty by 1,000 invisible threads. He didn't rule from a throne. He ruled from a desk. And somewhere in those pages between the ink and the silence, you begin to understand why it broke him. You step back into the hallway, and it's like coming up for air if the air was made of incense and quiet judgment. The study door clicks behind you, muffling the scent of ink and old resolve. Ahead, another chamber. Larger, more ornate, not meant for administration or reflection, but for performance. You've entered the public shell of power. And that means you're about to encounter Philip's favorite tools: faith, fear, and fire. This is the room where the Inquisition was discussed. Not conducted, let's be clear. Philip didn't burn heretics in his slippers. But this was where strategy met salvation, and where decisions about who lived, who converted, and who vanished into flame were made in whispered Latin beneath tapestries of saints. You feel it the moment you enter. The walls are higher here. The floor, black and white tile, clicks with a sense of ceremonial danger. The chairs are lined in velvet. There's a lectern in the corner. A candle stands on top of it, and next to that, a thin iron poker. It was used to heat wax seals and occasionally test sincerity. Spain under Philip wasn't just Catholic. It was Catholicism as national identity. Being anything else, Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, wasn't just blasphemy. It was treason. Philip saw no difference between rebellion and heresy. To question Rome was to question the king. And to question the king was to question God's will. You pause in front of a portrait. It shows Philip in armor, hand on a crucifix, foot on a globe. Behind him, smoke curls upward. You realize it's not battlefield smoke, it's pyre smoke. Someone somewhere is burning for belief. A small plaque beneath it reads, "Faith before fear." You wonder if that was his motto, or his excuse. The Spanish Inquisition was technically older than Philip, but under his watch it became institutional perfection. Courts, tribunals, torture chambers sanitized by prayer. Heretics were often given chances to confess, to repent. But if they didn't, fire. And Philip never flinched. He believed this was mercy. You shudder. He didn't attend executions himself, too private, too delicate. But he always knew the numbers, read the reports, approved the edicts. There's a small wooden box on a nearby table. Inside, a scorched rosary bead, taken according to legend from a Protestant woman burned at the stake for refusing to deny her beliefs. Philip kept it, not as a trophy, but as proof of righteousness, of consequence, of what happens when God is questioned too loudly. Historians still argue whether Philip was a fanatic or simply a monarch in a world that demanded brutal unity. Some claim he believed too much. Others say he didn't believe at all, just weaponized piety like any other crown jewel. But the outcomes remain the same. You walk toward the far end of the room. Another candle flickers near a wooden confessional. It's empty now, but the curtain is open. You wonder if Philip ever entered it. If he whispered through that little lattice and confessed what weighed on him, thousands, dead thousands more. Silenced, and a kingdom held together by ash and penance. Would absolution even be possible? You sit for a moment in one of the velvet chairs. It creaks slightly under your weight. Across the room, a stained glass window filters colored light across the floor, crimson, gold, indigo. It falls on the chessboard tiles like spilled wine and bruises. You breathe. And you begin to understand, for Philip, religion wasn't a belief. It was a policy, a structure, a scaffolding for his guilt and glory. Within that scaffold, whole generations were suspended by fire, by silence, by fear. You leave the chamber of whispered smoke and silent judgment, trailing candle wax and the weight of invisible ashes on your shoulders. The hallway bends again, tighter now, the light dimmer, The walls more textured stone on one side, ancient wood on the other. You feel the presence of paper again, and instinctively you know where you're heading. Welcome to the war room, or rather, the windowless war room. This is where Philip waged his battles not with banners and bugles, but with documents. Memos, hand-drawn maps, supply manifests. Naval reports folded 12 times, annotated with amplius deliberandum, must deliberate further. He waged war like a librarian, fights fire very slowly, and with excellent filing. There are no swords here, only pens. No maps pinned with flags, just flat parchment smoothed by cold fingers and hot breath. You stand before a table. It's long oak with a velvet runner and stacks of correspondence sorted by region Flanders, France, the Americas, England. There's a small stack labeled Sea Matters. You find it strangely poetic. This is where the fate of the Spanish Armada was decided, not on the open sea, not on the deck of a galleon, but right here in a room with no breeze. Philip never set foot on a battlefield. His armor was ceremony. His sword was legacy. And he wore both like weights rather than weapons. He fought by delegation, sending generals dispatching fleets, approving supply lines. But always from here, always through others, and often through hesitation. You pick up a note. It's a plea from a field commander, send reinforcements. Supplies low, morale lower. It's dated 3 months before the Armada's launch. Philip's reply scribbled in red, consult advisors. Pray for clarity. You don't know whether to laugh or weep. The Armada, of course, failed, famously, with a kind of tragic flair only Spanish oak and English weather can conjure together. Ships scattered, sailors drowned, dreams sunk. And Philip, he simply waited for letters to return from the coast like sad birds with broken wings. Historians still argue whether the Armada was doomed by design or delay. Whether Philip trusted God too much or his admirals too little. What's certain is this: the man believed himself a servant of divine providence. And divine providence, it turns out, doesn't always check the tide schedule. You run your fingers across the map of England spread open before you. It's hand-drawn aged with faint ink notations along the southern coast. Targets, hopes, ghosts now. In the far corner, a small cabinet is cracked open. Inside, rows of scrolls tied with ribbons. Military expenditures, perhaps, or perhaps just lists of ships that never came back. Philip was not a dreamer. He didn't launch the Armada chasing glory. He launched it chasing unity, Catholic unity, European unity, his unity. And in doing so, scattered more than ships. You take a seat at the table and let the silence wash over you. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of unfinished battles. Behind you, a door creaks. A clerk steps in, places a new document on the table, and vanishes without a word. The candle beside you flickers. It smells like wax and worry. You glance down at the paper. It's blank. Maybe Philip hadn't read it yet. Or maybe, like so many things in his world, it was waiting for the right kind of silence. You find yourself wandering upward now, drawn not by instinct, but by architecture. Escorial staircases are never dramatic. They don't sweep or boast. They climb quietly, as if trying not to disturb the dead. The stone underfoot is worn in the middle, smoothed by centuries of careful ascents. You follow that same path, wondering what waited at the top for a man who carried the weight of kingdoms in his knees. At the landing, a corridor stretches before you, lined with tall, narrow windows. At last, light. Real sunlight. Not filtered through candles or stained glass, just honest, plain Castilian daylight. It doesn't warm you, not really. But after the rooms below, even the faintest sunbeam feels like rebellion. This wing once housed foreign ambassadors, Distant cousins favored nobles. But you're not here for them. You're here for her. Mary Tudor, Queen of England, Philip's second wife, and possibly the most tragic chapter in a life already built from loss. The hallway turns into a private chamber, one unused now, though not empty. Dust cloaks the furniture like a funeral shroud. The bed is small, English in shape, but Spanish in ornament. Near it, a desk with a half-burned candle, and above it a painting. Mary, red hair coiled like fire, pale skin almost translucent, her gaze not harsh, but begging. Philip married her out of strategy. England was a prize. A Protestant prize, yes, but one that could be reconquered through marriage and patience. The union was supposed to be political salvation. It became emotional damnation. Mary adored Philip. She truly did. Wrote him letters thick with yearning, waited for him at court windows, fell ill when he delayed. Her love was not returned in kind, at least not in the way she gave it. Philip showed up for the wedding, the coronation, and then he left. He was absent more than present, a ghost with a crown. Still she hoped. She believed she was pregnant. Multiple times. Each one ended in blood, not birth. Her people called it divine punishment. Her court whispered about hysteria. Her enemies laughed. Philip stayed away. When she died in 1558, he was in Brussels. He did not race home. He sent condolences. Politely. Formally. England passed to her half-sister Elizabeth. And with her all Philip's hopes of uniting the Catholic crowns dissolved like sugar in tea. Historians still argue whether Philip ever truly loved Mary or merely tolerated her, whether he mourned her quietly or merely filed her death under foreign affairs. But he kept her portrait, hung it here, far from the public halls, close to silence. You study it now, her eyes follow you. Or maybe they follow him, the man who never came back. The man who said yes at the altar and no with his absence. Below the painting, a folded letter. You don't dare open it, but the handwriting, small, neat English, tells you enough. She wrote to him even after it was clear he wouldn't return. You look around the room. There are no symbols of power here, no maps, no saints. Just loss and longing. A wooden chest in the corner bears the Tudor rose. Cracked, faded, like her dreams of Catholic restoration, like the marriage itself. And you begin to understand something. Philip didn't just collect relics, he collected regrets. And he kept them like trophies. Silent, labeled, locked behind walls. You descend again, another narrow staircase spiraling gently downward like thought itself, until you emerge in a corridor lined not with portraits or crucifixes, but doors. Closed ones. Heavy oak. No names on them, but you know which one matters. Don Carlos, Philip's only son from his first marriage. His heir, his agony, his undoing. You pause before the door. Even now, centuries later, it radiates unease. No candle here, no incense. Just the cool smell of aged wood and something more elusive guilt soaked so deep into the grain, it no longer smells like sin, just history. You push it open. The room is plain, Spartan. Not prison-like in design, but unmistakably one in function. A bed, a table, a single stool. No windows, only slits cut high into the wall where daylight seeps in like reluctant truth. This is where Philip kept his son. Not metaphorically, literally. Don Carlos was locked in this chamber in 1568, not for days, not for weeks, for months. You step inside and feel the chill bite your skin like a secret trying to get your attention. The air is still, undisturbed, like it's waiting for Carlos to wake up again and resume his pacing. But he won't, because he never left. Let's go back. Carlos was not born. easy. Physically deformed, with a twisted spine, uneven shoulders, and a head just a little too large. He was erratic, impulsive, reckless. Some called him brilliant, others mad. He threatened servants, tried to stab a tutor, and once reportedly kicked a man down the stairs for disagreeing about a map. And yet, he was the heir. Philip tried. He really did. Tutors, clergy, physicians. The best minds in Spain tried to mold the prince into something usable. But Carlos resisted. He didn't want structure. He wanted attention. And he learned early that causing chaos earned more of it than obedience ever would. Then something snapped. In 1568, rumors swirled that Carlos plotted to flee Spain and ally with rebels in Flanders. Or maybe he just wanted to escape his father's gaze. Either way, Philip made his decision. Carlos was arrested by royal guards at night, no warning, and locked in this very room. He was 19. He died 6 months later, starved, fevered, likely infected by wounds left untreated. Some say suicide, others poison. The official cause, natural decline. Historians still argue whether Philip ordered his son's death or merely allowed it to happen. You move toward the bed. The mattress is thin, the frame chipped. The ceiling feels lower than it should. Claustrophobia creeps in, slow and steady. You imagine Carlos here, furious, pacing, pleading, then quieter and slower and still. There's a scorch mark on the floor. Unremarkable. Until you realize it's where a candle burned too long. Maybe he forgot to blow it out. Or maybe he wanted to watch the flame consume something since he himself could not leave. In the far corner, a faint etching on the wall. A name, maybe. Or just scratches. They trail off halfway down like the hand that made them ran out of strength or hope. You whisper something, though you're not sure what. An apology, a prayer there's no reply. This room doesn't echo. It absorbs. And you begin to understand the worst part. Philip loved his son, in his way, with rules and fears and distance. He wanted Carlos to be strong. Carlos wanted to be seen. Neither got what they needed. You step out of the suffocating silence of Don Carlos's prison lungs, aching for air, mind heavy with shadows. The corridor feels colder now, not in temperature but in tone. You've just left a room where hope was extinguished with discipline. And now you walk toward one where it flickered briefly brightly, and then died out just the same. Her name was Elizabeth of Valois, Philip's third wife, his French queen, and by many accounts, the only one he truly loved. The door to her chamber is carved with a delicate floral pattern, faded by time, but still soft beneath your fingers. You push it open slowly, and unlike so many other rooms in El Escorial, this one welcomes you with something unexpected light. Filtered, gentle golden, it spills across the stone floor like a sigh. The windows here small, yes, but unobstructed. The shutters are open. The room breathes. The bed is modest, but finely carved, the linen's a pale shade of saffron, now dulled to ivory. There's a dressing table with a polished mirror, one of the only in the palace. Beside it, a silver comb. On the far wall, a portrait. Elizabeth. Youthful, soft-featured. Her gaze lifted not at the viewer, but toward something just above and beyond. Her hands rest on her lap, and you realize she's holding a small, half-bloomed rose. You step closer. The rose is not symbolic. It was personal. They said she planted them in pots along her balcony. Even in a monastery palace built from granite and prayer, she found ways to bring life in. Elizabeth married Philip when she was just 14. He was 32. It was like all royal marriages, political, a peace treaty in a dress. But something happened that no one expected. They grew to care for each other. She was clever, charming, fluent in multiple languages, and brought a spark to the rigid court. Even Philip the famously grim began to smile more, to walk the gardens with her, to sit beside her during music, to show affection in quiet, dignified gestures, a hand on the shoulder. A glance held just a moment longer than protocol allowed. And then, in 1568, yes, that cursed year again, she died. At 23. Complications from miscarriage, they say, or infection. The specifics blur, but the ache remains. Philip was devastated. And that word is not used lightly. He did not eat. He did not leave his room for days. The court froze, uncertain how to proceed without his instruction. The king of ink and control unraveled. You glance around the room now. A shawl is draped over the back of a chair. Old, probably not hers, but placed here later in her memory. There's a small painting on the nightstand, one of those devotional images of the Virgin Mary cradling a child. And beneath it, a pressed flower sealed under glass. It's a rose. Historians still argue whether Philip's grief was personal or performative. But this room, unchanged, tells its own story. He preserved it, left it untouched, as though she might return one morning, brushing her hair by the window, humming softly. There's a notebook on the desk, likely a facsimile, but faithful. It holds a page of Elizabeth's French handwriting. A poem, a letter. You can't read all the words, but one repeats mon cœur, my heart. You sit on the bench beneath the window and stare out at the garden beyond, small controlled trimmed to order. But along the far edge, climbing stubbornly along the wall, are roses, still blooming, still reaching, still defying the palace stone, like her. You step away from Elizabeth's chamber, and something clings to you, her warmth perhaps, or the echo of a lighter time, long buried beneath layers of penance and protocol. But Escorial never lets you float for long. It pulls you back down, into shadows, into systems. This next corridor takes you to a room not built for comfort or contemplation. It's built for instruction. The royal school. A space where boys became courtiers, and courtiers became extensions of Philip's will. The king believed in education, not as liberation, but as discipline. Minds weren't to be expanded, they were to be shaped. You stepped through the tall oak door and into a long hall. Benches, desks, a black slate board, windows too high for daydreaming. It smells like dust and chalk and old parchment. The only color comes from the trim of the boys' robes and portraits along the walls, indigo, russet, saffron, teal. Colors meant to signal rank, not expression. This is where Philip trained not just his sons, but the sons of nobles, ambassadors, and generals. He built a future Spain here, one grammar correction at a time. And he watched them. Yes, watched. There's a narrow gallery running above the far wall, an observation perch hidden behind a wooden grate. Philip used it. Philip, he'd sit for hours silently, observing lessons. Not to interfere, just to know. To see who whispered, who slouched, who recited Latin verse without stumbling. A king who supervised his empire down to the ink on schoolboys' fingers. You walk past a desk and notice a notebook left open. A page of copied scripture. Beneath it, a doodle clumsy childlike. A small ship with an oversized sail. It looks like a dream sneaking past the guards. A tutor once wrote that students in Escorial do not dream, they remember. And that's how Philip wanted it. No distractions. No rebellion. Just obedience disguised as enlightenment. You pause by the lectern where religious instruction was delivered. A crucifix hangs above it, not serene but stern. Christ's eyes not closed in suffering, but open watching. Judging, historians still argue whether this school was a cradle of excellence or a factory of fear. whether Philip empowered future leaders or broke them before they could rise. Either way, they learned what mattered most: to write neatly, to kneel correctly, to speak only when asked. You glance toward the gallery again. Imagine Philip seated above, cloaked in shadow quill, in hand making notes on posture and pronunciation. Not out of malice, but because he believed that order started young, that if you bent a tree early, it would never grow wild. The bell rope in the corner hangs limp, once rung at dawn, again at midday, and once more when prayers began. Time was measured here not in hours, but in obedience. You pick up a slate and run your fingers across its surface. Cold, scratched, like 1,000 forgotten lessons. Like the boys who passed through here, some to greatness, some to war, some to oblivion. You wonder if Carlos sat here once before the darkness took him. If he whispered a joke, if someone laughed, if Philip heard it and wrote it down. You leave the schoolroom behind, stepping into yet another stretch of hallway, this one darker, lined with arched windows, mostly shuttered against the afternoon sun. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls. Once, then again. The sound rolls through the stones, like a reminder time passes here, but only just. The next chamber is one few outsiders ever saw, and fewer understood. You step through a heavy door into a small study filled with whispers, not real ones, but the kind that cling to wood and velvet long after voices have stopped. This is the room where Philip met his confessor. Not courtiers, not generals, not ministers, just men in robes. The walls here are lined with simple bookshelves, some still bearing leather-bound volumes of theology, Latin tracts, and tightly curled scrolls wrapped in silk ribbons. A crucifix dominates one corner, flanked by 2 wooden stools. No desk, no ink. This was not a place for commands. It was a place for confession, and Philip used it. Frequently, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times in one day. You sit on the stool opposite the crucifix. The silence is different here. Not heavy, not strategic, but expectant. Like the room is waiting for a sin to surface. Philip's conscience was not quiet. For all his composure, for all his micromanaging, he never stopped fearing damnation. Not in the abstract, not in theory. Personally. Vividly. This was the king who paused mid-campaign planning to pray for clarity, who delayed major decisions if he hadn't yet spoken with a priest, who feared not just the consequences of action, but the eternal weight of it. He confessed things no other king would have. Impure thoughts, prideful decisions, even doubts about the very wars he waged. There's a report, a real one, of him weeping during a confession after the death of Elizabeth. Another after Don Carlos. He begged for reassurance, that he'd done what was right, that it hadn't all been for nothing. Historians still argue whether Philip's piety was a political smokescreen or a psychological burden. But in this room, you sense no performance, no audience, just a man in the void he hoped God was filling. A small wooden box sits in the corner. Inside a worn cloth, stole a priest's vestment faded at the edges. It's thin from use. Beneath it, a rosary made of olive pits, strung on a thread, fraying with age. You touch the wood of the stool again. It's been polished smooth, not by craftsmanship, but by elbows, by repetition. Confession for Philip was not just about forgiveness. It was part of his strategy. A way to maintain spiritual control as tightly as he held political control. If his conscience stayed clean, or at least managed, then surely God would bless the empire. Surely. You glance at the bookshelf again. One volume lies open. Its Latin script is careful, almost lyrical. A passage from Augustine, something about guilt being a mirror through which the soul sees itself clearly. You don't read Latin, but the message is plain enough even kings must kneel. And Philip more than most needed to. Because while his court admired him for strength and his enemies feared his resolve, Philip feared only one thing: being wrong in the eyes of God. The door closes behind you with a hushwood on stone, like a sigh held too long. You walk again deeper into the palace, though palace feels like the wrong word now. Cloister, tomb, womb. Escorial is all three at once. Birthplace of legacies, burial ground for hopes, and quiet cradle for the slow unraveling of a man who ruled everything except his own heart. You find yourself in one of the rarest spaces in the entire complex, the Hall of Ancestors. A long rectangular room, no furniture, no music, just portraits. Dozens of them, hung in perfect sequence along the walls, each frame a silent shout into eternity. You come from this. Charles V Ferdinand, Isabella, a line of monarchs stretching backward into blood war prayer and uncomfortable dynastic marriages. Each face painted with a stiff, sainted calm. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same crown balanced on heads that knew more about migraines than miracles. Philip stood here often, not for vanity, but for accountability. These weren't just family, they were the standard. He'd walk from one end to the other, examining each portrait as if expecting them to speak, to approve, or to scowl. You imagine him stopping at Charles V, his father, his thundercloud, the man who ruled both heaven's shadow and Europe's map. Charles, who gave it all up, abdicated, retreated to a monastery, and died quietly. Philip never forgave him for that, because Philip didn't get to retreat. He inherited everything, and everyone, and then spent the next 40 years trying to deserve it. You stop in front of one portrait, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, Philip's great-grandmother. Her eyes wide, frantic, almost pleading. She ruled with madness, whispered in every corner. You wonder if Philip feared that too. Not just failure, but internal collapse. Historians still argue whether Philip's obsession with legacy drove his paranoia or soothed it. Whether these portraits were reminders of glory or ghosts of impossible expectations. Some say he whispered prayers to them. Others say he debated them aloud. You stare into Charles V's painted gaze. It's unblinking, merciless. You realize this isn't a hall of memory, it's a courtroom. One Philip entered daily, testifying with every decision he made. The final portrait on the far wall is blank. You weren't expecting that. A frame gilded, empty, waiting. This was where Philip's likeness was to be placed. It never was. He refused to commission the final portrait, not because of humility, but because he didn't believe his work was finished, even as his body decayed, even as his hands curled in pain. He believed the king must serve until the last breath. So the wall ends not with closure, but with absence. You feel it like a hole in your chest. Because no matter how many faces line these walls, none of them could ever show Philip what he really was. Not a warrior, not a saint, not even a ruler, but a man trapped in the family business of destiny with no exit sign. You leave the Hall of Ancestors behind your footsteps, swallowed by the soft stone floor. And for a moment, you feel like you're drifting through a palace made entirely of memory. But the corridor ahead draws you back to the present, or rather, to the closing of a life lived almost entirely in the past. You're approaching the sick room, Philip's final quarters, the place where the king, the emperor, the oracle of a Catholic empire withered into a man of linen and groans. The door here doesn't creak. It sighs. Inside a narrow bed low to the ground, a crucifix above the headboard, massive and deliberate. No art, no tapestries, no distractions. Just plain walls and a small table cluttered with holy relics. Bones, thorns, cloths, beads, like a spiritual first aid kit. For a man who knew healing was no longer the goal, only grace. You move closer and notice the bed linens are stained. Not with blood, he'd long passed that stage, but with something more human. Sweat, pus, the bodily resignation that comes at the edge of life. Philip spent his final weeks here, in this room, suffering and refusing to stop working. He dictated letters from this bed, signed decrees with a trembling hand, received priests, received ministers, received silence, and through it all, pain. Blistering, burning, bone-deep agony. From gout, from infection, from the slow failure of a body pushed too long in service to a throne that never rested. One physician wrote that the king's legs rotted as he ruled. And that was before the ulcers burst. There's a stool at the foot of the bed where courtiers took turns pretending they weren't watching him die. A basin nearby, a cloth still folded. You wonder who folded it last, and whether they were praying as they did it. You spot a small wooden box beside the bed. Inside a nail, allegedly from the true cross. Philip asked for it nightly, to hold, to clutch, to compare pain, as if to say, I too suffer for salvation. Historians still argue whether Philip believed he was earning heaven or simply enduring penance. Whether he saw this as justice for his sins or just the final bitter price of kingship. The priest who administered his last rites said Philip confessed for hours. Hours. As though he could finally unburden himself of a lifetime's worth of state-sponsored suffering, wars, executions, sons locked away, wives buried, thousands dead. And still he clung to ritual. He died whispering prayers. He died gripping that nail. He died alone, because even with servants, confessors, and ministers surrounding him, no one could carry the crown with him across the threshold. You look down at the bed. It's smaller than it should be for a man who ruled half the known world. But maybe that's the final lesson. No matter how vast your empire, your final address is the same size as everyone else's. You step away from the deathbed, your hand brushing the door frame like a final farewell. Though Philip himself never truly said goodbye to his crown, to his sins, or to the people who served him, until his breath slipped out, like the last line of a prayer. The hallway now is silent, colder, more absolute. It leads down. Not to the crypt, not yet, but to the place where his legacy was sorted, sealed, and sent forward into history, like a dispatch from a lifeless hand. You enter the royal archive. This room is long, rectangular, almost monastic in its austerity. It smells like dust and ink and binding glue. There's a faint scratch of parchment as the air stirs the edges of documents shelved for centuries. Rows of oak cabinets flank the walls, each drawer marked with a Roman numeral and a soft red wax seal. No scrolls left unrolled. No pages dog-eared. Everything filed, everything preserved. Philip's ghost, you suspect, is here most of all. He lived in documents, and now he lives in them. This is where his legacy was curated, not sculpted in marble, not sung by poets, but typed in looping inked hands across thousands of pages. Every letter he sent, every command, every confession, even his shopping lists. You pass a shelf labeled Flans 1570, 1580. Inside records of a decade's worth of war and uprising debates over heresy, burnt villages, broken treaties. Another drawer, smaller Carlos. You hesitate. Inside, you imagine a dozen sealed reports, medical notes, interrogations, final entries. An entire relationship boiled into bureaucracy. You open a case gently and find a folder labeled Elizabeth. It contains only 6 pages. Her dowry, her death certificate, one unsigned letter. That's all she became on paper. And yet he kept it. Historians still argue whether Philip's obsession with documentation was devotion to truth or shield against doubt. Whether he believed writing everything down would save his soul or at least control how the world remembered it. Because memory is malleable, but records endure. You walk to a central table where several documents lie unbound. One is marked Philippe II, Ultima Voluntad, his will. Not poetic, not personal, just precise. He left money for masses, instructions for burial, allocations for charity, but no final words of love. No regrets on parchment, not even a mention of his wives by name. They were absorbed into the ledger of his kingship, their memories etched in budgets and alliances. This too was his theology, not grand gestures, but endless management. You close the drawers softly and look toward the high windows. The light here is filtered high and tight, like it's being rationed. Even the sun must obey the archive. You wonder what Philip would make of the modern world, where kings are documented, not in Latin, but in tweets. Would he scoff? Would he fear it? Or would he try to read every single one? Because to him, the pen was the only blade that ever mattered. And the page the only battlefield that could be conquered forever. The path bends again, this time toward stone steps, leading to the lower levels. The air shifts cooler now, more still. You descend slowly each step, muffled by centuries of silence, until you reach the one place even kings must eventually bow to, the pantheon of kings. This is no ordinary crypt. It is a vault. A circle carved from polished marble with walls that curve inward like a cathedral's whispered breath. The ceiling is low, but not oppressive. Rather, it humbles you like stooping to enter a sacred space where time itself holds its breath. Here beneath El Escorial lie the bodies of Spain's monarch. 26 sarcophagi line the walls stacked in symmetrical rows, each one bearing the same inscription, a royal name, a date, a silence. Philip II rests here too. You approach his tomb. Black marble, gilded edges. The inscription reads simply, Philips II, Hispaniarvium Rex no flourish. No epitaph. Just name title finality. It's oddly modest for a man who once governed a globe-straddling empire. But you realize it was designed this way. By him. Philip ordered the Pantheon's construction. He chose the shape, the materials, the placement. He called it the House of Death and insisted it reflect humility, not majesty. No statues, no trumpets, just dust sealed in silence. And yet there is beauty here. The kind of reverent design that suggests awe, not fear. The walls are paneled with gray marble veined in crimson, like dried blood beneath polished skin. The gold accents are not ornamental, they're skeletal, deliberate. A reminder that even empire has bones. You stand before his tomb and close your eyes. It's hard to picture him here. This was a man of corridors and ink, of incense and insomnia. A man who spoke to God through architecture and to Europe through marginalia. And yet, here he is, still, unmoving. Historians still argue whether Philip achieved the greatness he desired or merely survived his own burdens longer than most. Whether he saved Catholic Europe or simply slowed its fragmentation. But here in the heart of stone, none of that matters. There are no arguments in the Pantheon, no policies, no heresies, no heirs waiting in the wings, only kings and their secrets. A few feet away lies Charles the Vicar Philip's father, the one who abdicated, the one who handed his son the globe and said, "Try not to drop it." Did Philip ever forgive him? No one knows. They lie now in the same circle. their marble boxes separated by a few feet and 1,000 unresolved prayers. You imagine Philip's last breath, slow, ragged, exhaling not just life, but 4 decades of strategy, sacrifice, and sleepless service. And then the lid lowered. Not by generals, not by popes, but by the stonemason's hand. You leave the Pantheon slowly backtracking through the same narrow stairwell, as if retracing the king's life in reverse. And when you emerge once more into the corridors of Escorial, the silence feels different. Less like absence, more like waiting. But Philip's legacy isn't just sealed beneath marble. It echoes in paintings, in walls, in the eyes of those who still debate what exactly he left behind. You turn toward one of the lesser-known galleries, modest in size, but packed with relics of a different kind. Not bones, not swords, but images. This is the Hall of Shadows, as the monks once called it. And it's lined with portraits, not of Philip, of his enemies. You pause at the first canvas, Elizabeth I of England. Flame-haired, sharp-eyed, draped in pearls and poise, the queen who thwarted his armada, who outlived his marriages, who turned her Protestant island into a fortress. He hated her, respected her, perhaps even feared her. Beside her, a sketch of William of Orange, the Dutch rebel, the heretic, the freedom fighter or terrorist, depending on which side of history you're reading. Philip put a price on his head. William responded with pamphlets, poetry, and rebellion. These portraits aren't grand. They're cold, clinical, commissioned not to admire but to understand, to study, like exhibits in a gallery of regret. And then there's one you weren't expecting. A young man. Dark curls, arched brows, a slight tilt of the head as if resisting some unspoken rule. Don Carlos. Again. Not in pain. Not in chains. Just watching you. You wonder if Philip passed this portrait in his final years, if he stopped here and whispered something, an apology, a defense. No one recorded it. But someone hung the painting. Someone let it stay. Historians still argue whether these images were kept as warnings or trophies. Did Philip surround himself with adversaries to remember his failures, or to convince himself that righteousness often walks alone? You stand in the center of the room and turn slowly. It feels like a confessional, like walking inside the mind of a king who replayed every decision, every betrayal, every rebellion, and refused to look away. One final painting hangs in the corner. It's unfinished. A woman's silhouette. No features. Just the outline. A mystery. You lean closer and find a name scrawled faintly in the frame, Juana. Juana of Austria. Philip's sister. His confidant. His shadow twin. She ruled in his name when he was away. Advised him. Calmed him. Corrected him. He trusted her more than any other. And yet, we rarely speak of her. Even in death, Philip's story swallows everyone around him. Because that's what power does. It eclipses, it preserves, and it forgets. The gallery door closes behind you like a soft breath taken before a final prayer. You're back in the labyrinth now, Escorial's winding corridors, where light fades into memory, and every footstep sounds like a page turning in a book only one man ever read. You're approaching the final set of private chambers, spaces rarely entered, even by the most trusted servants. A set of rooms where Philip spent his last years, not in grandeur or ceremony, but in fragile, paranoid retreat. This is where he listened, not to music, to whispers. These rooms were designed for surveillance, not with glass or wires, but with human ears. Narrow peepholes drilled into wooden panels, hollowed spaces behind walls. Servants positioned not to clean, but to observe. Courtiers were watched. Diplomats were listened to. Even family members were followed by echo. Philip didn't trust easily, and by the end, he trusted no one. You step inside the chamber and feel it instantly, the claustrophobia of control. The curtains are heavy, the chairs narrow, high-backed, facing away from each other. The windows barely open. You hear nothing but your own breathing, and even that feels suspect. On the far wall, a writing desk. Of course, covered with letters, still sealed. Some opened, others half-scrawled with red ink corrections and underlines. Even dying, Philip couldn't stop editing. He revised other people's letters, changed wording in dispatches, crossed out loyal and replaced it with submissive. There's a letter lying face down. You flip it over. It's a request for aid from a Spanish governor in the Americas, dated months before Philip's death. No response. Just 2 words in red, too late. You sit in the high-backed chair. It creaks like a confession. This was where Philip spent his final days, not gazing over his empire, but staring at walls, listening to secrets, trying to outmaneuver enemies he could no longer name. Was he paranoid? Certainly. But was he wrong? Historians still argue whether Philip's fear of conspiracy was rooted in fact or just a side effect of absolute power. Whether his isolation protected Spain or slowly starved it. You walk toward a narrow shelf filled with tiny scrolls, each one labeled with a single name. Luis, Diego, Ana. No context, no title, just names. Spies, confidants, betrayers, or all 3. A man once said that to serve under Philip was to be watched by a shadow cast in every direction. And you believe it now. These rooms weren't built to welcome people. They were designed to filter them, to sort truth from loyalty, and loyalty from usefulness. On the floor lies a small brass bell, tarnished, silent. It was used to summon attendants, though. By the end, Philip rang it less and less. What was the point? He already knew what they would say. He always knew, even when it broke him. You return to the desk and pick up the final document. It's not official, not signed, just a list, a private one. It reads, Elizabeth Carlos, England, Flanders, Bayek, got no notes. No instructions, just those names. And now one more at the bottom, scribbled in weaker ink, and you set it down. Your fingers trembling just slightly, because you understand now. Philip didn't die surrounded by enemies. He died surrounded by questions. And his own name was the last one he dared ask. The door creaks open to yet another corridor, but this one is narrower, dimmer, almost breathing with its own tension. You move slowly as though the walls might shift behind you and seal you in. El Escorial doesn't just enclose it, digests. And now you're entering the strangest room of all. The relic chamber. It is part vault, part chapel, part ossuary. The air smells of myrrh beeswax, and something older like incense burned so long ago it became the stone. The walls here don't speak. They stare. Every surface is packed top to bottom with reliquaries, gold caskets, ivory boxes, tiny vials sealed with wax and prayer. Philip loved this place. Not admired, loved. He spent hours here meditating among saints' bones, splinters of the true cross flakes of apostolic skin, alleged hair from the Virgin Mary's veil, and more dubious tokens like a baby tooth labeled simply Sanctus Unknownus. You stand in the middle of the room, slowly turning in place. The dim torchlight flickers across glass displays like a votive vigil. The shadows shimmer over labels written in Latin, French, Greek, each one promising you're within sniffing distance of the divine. And Philip knew them all. He cataloged each relic by hand, assigned locations, wrote miniature biographies of the saints to whom the bones once belonged. To him, they weren't curiosities. They were anchors spiritual gravity, holding the Spanish monarchy in alignment with heaven. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, that Philip once canceled a meeting with his war council because he discovered a mislabeled relic. He corrected it himself, then fasted for 2 days. Historians still argue whether Philip's obsession with relics was devout piety or spiritual insurance. Was he chasing salvation or collecting leverage against God? You approach a small silver casket. The plaque reads, Digitus Sancti Laurenti, the finger of St. Lawrence. Burned alive on a gridiron, he reportedly told his executioners, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." Philip found that story hilarious and terrifying. Because Lawrence's martyrdom was not just about pain, it was about endurance, obedience, timing. 3 of Philip's private rings are stored nearby, each containing a fragment of a different saint. He wore them like armor, but not against men, against himself. You find a corner shelf holding letters, prayers actually, folded pieces of parchment with messages scrawled in Philip's shaky hand, not addressed to family or bishops, to relics. He wrote to bones. May your pain outlast mine. Tell God I tried. Forgive my judgment if not my justice. You don't know if the letters were ever meant to be read or just felt. Because when your kingdom is so vast that you can't walk from one side to the other in a lifetime, your confessions have to go somewhere. And bones don't talk back. You sit briefly on the wooden bench at the center of the room. The stone beneath your feet is worn smooth, not from pilgrims, but from Philip. He came here again and again, whispering to saints, hoping that heaven, unlike his court, might finally answer. But it never did, so he wrote another note, and added another relic, and tried to outfaith the silence. You rise from the wooden bench in the relic chamber, the silence still clinging to your clothes, like incense smoke. And as you step into the hallway again, you realize you've seen nearly every room in which Philip ruled, mourned, repented, or controlled. But not the one where he dreamed, if he ever did. You follow a short passage lit by a single high window. Its narrow beam of light strikes a closed door, not grand, not even particularly well carved, just there. Solid, stubborn, almost overlooked. This is Philip's private chapel. You push it open gently, and the room exhales. It's small, intimate, vaulted like a monk's cell. At the far end stands an altar stone not gilded. A single iron crucifix hangs above it, arms spread wide in pain and permanence. No flowers, no gold, no ornamentation, except for a single candle flickering in a pool of its own wax. This was where the most powerful man in the Western world went to kneel. And he did daily without fail. No choirs, no pageantry, just whispered Latin sometimes, weeping, sometimes silent. There were days, they say, when he would stay here for hours not moving, just existing or trying to. A kneeler remains by the altar, its leather cushion cracked from use, worn in the exact shape of his knees. You step closer and spot the book beside it, an open breviary, its pages gently curled. The ribbon marker rests between 2 psalms. You read the Latin aloud quietly. It speaks of solitude, of perseverance, of waiting for grace without demanding it. Philip would have liked that. He believed God was not to be pleased, only obeyed. There's no throne in this room, no footstool, no cushion. Just cold stone and the idea that pain purifies. Even prayer here is architecture pointed bare vertical. There's nowhere to hide. On the right wall, a small wooden door is inset so seamless you nearly miss it. It's not a closet. It's a passage, a hidden one. Philip had it built so he could pass from his bedroom to the chapel without being seen. without speaking, without explaining. He'd slip into prayer before sunrise returned, before anyone noticed. Not because he feared scandal, because he feared interruption. Historians still argue whether Philip's faith was genuine or performative. But this room is not for show. No ambassadors came here. No portraits were painted. No decrees were signed. This was the one space he built for no one else. It smells of wax and dust and something older like devotion pressed into mortar. You notice that even the candle holder is simple. Iron, blackened. A single bend at the neck like it bows as well. You sit at the edge of the kneeler. Not to pray, just to understand. Because in this chamber, there are no answers. Only questions echoing softly against cold stone, and one man kneeling in the dark, whispering to a crucified silence, hoping his empire still made sense to heaven. You exit the chapel through the hidden passage Philip once used. And for a moment you're walking with him, not symbolically, but literally retracing his steps. The narrow corridor winds in hushed turns, its walls unadorned, built not to impress, but to isolate. You imagine the sound of his slippers brushing against the stone, breath-shallow thoughts louder than his footsteps. And when the passage opens again, it empties into a room so private, so interior, it might as well be a thought turned into architecture. The study, Philip's last one, the final place he worked. This is not the ornate library downstairs, the one with gilded spines and stained glass. No. This room is stripped of grandeur. Its shelves are narrow, its desk plain. A single oil lamp sits atop it, the wick burned low, the glass blackened with soot. You step inside and feel the stillness settle over you like dust. This was where he managed Spain in the final years, his legs failing, his stomach rotting, but his quill still moving. There's a chair tucked in beneath the desk, one leg slightly uneven. The cushion, if you can call it that, is flattened to the point of non-existence. A pair of spectacles rests beside an open ledger. The ink is faded but legible. Numbers, names, notations in the margin. Answer tomorrow. Check dispatch. God willing. This wasn't a room of philosophy. It was a room of control. Even as his body betrayed him, Philip insisted on approving grain reports, reading military inventories, editing diplomatic letters. There's a cabinet in the corner, filled with ink bottles, some empty, others still half full. The man ran out of strength before he ran out of corrections. You notice something else on the desk. A folded handkerchief stained with something dark, dried blood maybe, or ink, or a mixture of both. A seal ring rests on top of it, its imprint facing down. You don't turn it over. Some symbols are meant to remain pressed in absence. There's a small stool tucked beside the desk, where his secretary once sat reading correspondence aloud, while Philip corrected him. He rarely spoke loudly. Even here command came through whisper. If he raised his voice, something had gone very wrong. And then, on the far shelf, you find something that doesn't belong. A child's drawing, crude, charcoal lines on yellowed paper. A boat, a son, a man with a crown. It's labeled Papa. You feel your breath catch. Philip had children beyond Carlos. Daughters, sons, not all lived long. Not all were loved equally. But someone once drew this. For him. And he kept it. Not framed, just kept. Tucked between documents of empire. Historians still argue whether Philip ever separated the role of king from that of man, whether he saw himself as a father or just a patriarch of a geopolitical machine, whether his love ever broke through the stone. But this drawing, this one says maybe. You return to the desk and glance at the final item there, a single page of notes in his own hand. 3 words underlined twice. Fay. Orden, Silencio, faith, order, silence, his trinity, not just for his reign, but for his soul. You leave the study gently closing the door behind you, and it feels like sealing a box of echoes. The corridor curves left, then right, then opens again, but this time into air. You've reached the royal cloister, a square courtyard wrapped in arches, stone colonnades, framing a patch of trimmed grass and pale gravel. No flowers, no fountains, just emptiness perfectly measured. Philip came here to walk, not for exercise, for thought. He believed motion stirred clarity, that pacing in a sacred square aligned the soul. And so, even when his joints ached and his spine curved like a prayer bent too long, he shuffled through this space, counting steps, lips moving soundlessly. You step under the colonnade. The air is crisp, the sunlight clean. And for the first time, the weight lifts just slightly. You imagine him here wrapped in black, his cane tapping the stones, his rosary sliding between fingers, calloused more from writing than from war. His face unreadable, his thoughts sealed, but always walking. Even dying, he walked. Not far, not fast, but forward. One of the monks once wrote that Philip's walks carved hours into God's ledger, as if each lap around the cloister was a line of penance, a physical prayer scratched into time. The gravel path is still marked subtle grooves where countless footsteps wore the way. You follow them. A breeze stirs the hem of your coat. The air smells faintly of olive oil and paper. From one of the open windows above, you hear a murmur of chant, Benedictine probably. Low, steady, the kind of sound that turns a man inward. There's a bench beneath a cypress. A simple slab. No inscription. But you sit knowing he did too. Maybe on the day he learned Carlos was dying. Maybe after a battle was lost. Maybe after another night of silence from God. He sat here and looked out across this controlled square and wondered if it was enough. Historians still argue whether Philip's cloister walks were acts of devotion or of avoidance. Whether he sought wisdom in the rhythm of steps or merely couldn't bear to sit still with his own guilt. But here now the world slows. The sunlight finds its way between arches. The gravel settles, and for a moment you don't hear Spain or the Inquisition or the moans of empire. You hear nothing. Which to Philip might have been the closest thing to peace. You rise from the bench, the quiet still wrapped around you like an old robe, and follow the final hallway, not toward another chamber, but toward a set of doors rarely opened, even in Philip's day. They lead not to strategy, not to sanctuary, but to spectacle. This is the hall of battles. An enormous gallery, its ceiling vaulted high above your head, frescoes blooming across the walls like banners caught mid-flutter. Scenes of cannon fire, of cavalry charges, of flags hoisted over fallen walls. Victory caught in amber. Philip commissioned this room not as boast, but as memory. Spain's most glorious battles painted for eternity. You step forward, boots echoing softly on polished marble. The light is dim but deliberate cast through high arched windows so that everything glows as if lit by torchlight. The figures on the wall are not just soldiers. They are saints of the sword. Each face rendered in loving precision, each wound a kind of worship. Philip walked here alone often. They say he preferred dusk, when the battles looked more real, when the blood almost shimmered. You stop before one massive panel, the Battle of Lepanto. Ships locked like jaws, smoke curling skyward, and the sea churning red and green. In the corner, a young man with a wounded hand, Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother, the hero of the Holy League. Philip didn't fight there, but he won. By delegation, by funding, by silence. He knew how to conquer without stepping foot on the battlefield. And still he had this painted. Was it pride or proof? There's a smaller panel at the far end, the Siege of St. Quentin. Less known, more brutal. You study the details, the grim expressions, the angled lances, the field littered with fallen standards. And in one corner, a figure in black, not labeled, barely visible, but unmistakably him. Philip watching, not leading, observing, recording. Historians still argue whether Philip saw war as sacred duty or necessary ugliness, whether these paintings reflect genuine reverence or curated trauma. But here among the painted screams and gilded smoke, you sense something else. A man trying to convince himself it was all worth it. That the deaths bought peace, that the empire bled for a reason. You walk the length of the hall and count the battles, each one a tomb disguised as triumph, each one whispering you were here even when you weren't. At the end of the gallery, a plaque. It reads, Memoria Perpetua, perpetual memory. But memory for whom? The soldiers, the saints, or the man who wrote it all down and watched history sharpen itself in his name. You leave the hall with your footsteps fading behind you like drums gone quiet. You walk now through Escorial's final corridor, long, narrow, echoing with nothing but the hush of your own steps. The walls are blank here. No paintings, no portraits, no saints to guide you, just silence. And at the end, a window. Small, plain, perfectly square. You stop. From this window you can see the horizon, the brown hills, the folded cloak of Castile. The sky above flat and infinite like parchment, unmarked by any royal seal. Philip stood here too. Maybe not often, but enough. Enough to see what he couldn't rule. Enough to remember how small a king becomes when viewed from the outside. You stand there now as he once did and try to imagine the thoughts that filled his final hours. Not just the pain, not just the gout, the ulcers, the decaying limbs, but the reckoning. The inventory of choices made across decades. Wars started, letters sent, sons buried, faith clung to like a plank in a flood. The sun shifts, light spills across the stone floor, and for a moment it feels like you're watching the last breath of a building. Because Philip is gone. His empire fractured, his victories yellowed by time. But Escorial remains. And you're still standing in it. You turn from the window and head back through the corridor, past the rooms where he prayed, ruled, wept, and bled. Past the altars and archives. Past the portraits that did not forgive him and the shadows that never left. Because this is where he ended. Not on a battlefield, not in a throne room, but here, in a palace he built to house his ghosts, his saints, his failures, and maybe just maybe his soul. Now let yourself breathe. Let the walls of Escorial dissolve behind your eyes and feel the weight of the stone drop from your shoulders. You've walked the full length of a life hemmed in by duty, scarred by silence, stretched across a map and shrunk to a single room. Let your thoughts slow now, like Philip's final steps along the cloister. Let the shadows lengthen, and the voices of ministers, monks, and lost sons fade into whispers. You are not a king, but you've carried his weight for a while, and it's time to put it down. Feel your breath ease, your limbs soften, your mind settle. The empire is quiet now. The candle in the chapel has burned low. The nail has fallen from Philip's hand. There is no more parchment to sign, no more relics to touch, no more questions left to ask, just stillness. Let it hold you. Let it cradle you like the linen cradled his tired frame. Let it lull you. Because history isn't always loud. Sometimes it ends in silence. Good night.